Estás viendo Canal América, televisión dominicana para el mundo.
A Time for Truth show is sponsored by the office of Dr. Bernardfialkoff, a periodontal, dental implant and laser specialist in New York City, for over 40 years. Dr. Fialkoff was honored by the International College of Dentists and Pierre Fauchard, and received the Presidential Lifetime Humanitarian Honor from the White House. Call us at 718-229-3838.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard, you don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart, yeah. You try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got, but the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your fears.
Welcome to A Time for Truth show. I'm your host, Dr. Bernardfialkoff. It's a pleasure to be back with you again tonight. And many of you have been asking, how do I avail myself of all the previous episodes? Very simple. Click on YouTube, find A Time for Truth show. Hit the subscribe button. We'd love to have you as one of our members. There's no fee. There's no requirements. The only important factor is that you join this group that's bringing integrity, honesty, and prosperity to our futures across all countries, across this great planet. And with that recent trip to the moon, we realize how important we all are and how we're in the middle of the cosmos and we need to work together. So tonight we have something that you're going to enjoy because you using this and imbibing this, and it's part of your lives. And many times we take things for granted. It's important that we really know what is the real situation. What are the facts? And so tonight we're going to be talking to you about what's really in your water. Let's put up the first image. We're going to talk about the truth about tap versus bottled water. And if we can engineer, there we go. Thank you so much for putting up the image. Let's take a look at something. A simple water bottle, clear, sealed, and something that most of us trust without any hesitation. Most disposable water bottles are made from PET. What is PET? It's polyethylene tetraphthalate. And it's considered relatively stable. So it can still release small amounts of chemicals into the water, especially under conditions that we're going to go over in tonight's show. I look at it and looks harmless to me, but is it? Or are we better with something like this? That's steel, or steel with glass inside. How do we decide? Is this just an extravagance, or is there a difference? Let's put these aside and let's look further into what we're doing here. So let's put the next image, please, engineer. And we'll go over the recent scientific research and results have revealed that bottled water may contain far more than just the water. In fact, a 2024 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that 1 liter of bottled water contains an average of about 240,000 plastic particles, with most of them so small that they're invisible even using a standard microscope. Imagine that. And that's not a typo or an exaggeration. Hundreds of thousands of particles floating in your water in that single liter. Now, this doesn't mean it's necessarily harmful, but it raises an important question. What happens when this exposure in each bottle is repeated long term over years? Tonight, we're going to look at what is the reality, what is the actuality, and what the science is saying, and how it behaves in our body, and what we know and we don't know about long-term health risks, including serious diseases. Let's go to the next image, and let's continue as we go into this, as we drink from our plastic water containers. You can accept several different types of toxins that you can expect. They generally fall into whether they're physical or chemical. And basically, the physical ones are divided up into microplastics and nanoplastics. The microplastics are smaller than 5 millimeters, very tiny. They can cause physical irritation in your stomach, and they can carry other toxins into your system from the environment. What are nanoplastics? Where they're much smaller, actually smaller than 1 micrometer. Too small to even be visible. They're invisible. And a 2024 PNAS study found that that these particles were detected in so many of these bottled liquids. They're small enough that in theory they can transverse and go through certain biological barriers in our bodies, which are very important, which maintain what's called homeostasis, the normal functioning of the body. And they're so small they can enter tissues. And they come from the bottle itself, also from the cap, from the process of bottling, and from the membranes they use to filter the water. And research has identified multiple types of these plastic polymers in bottled water, including the PET of which bottles mostly are made. So something important to realize, also they found other residues such as polystyrene and polyamide. And a 2026 study at Ohio State University found that some bottled waters contained roughly 3 times more nanoplastics than treated tap water. So scientists are especially concerned about how they interact within our bodies and are really considered more dangerous because they could cross what's called the blood-brain barrier, entering individual cells and potentially causing oxidative stress and damage to our genes, to the DNA that's the structure, the basis of the cell, of the different functions, and the physiology and life in our bodies. The chemical additives are substances that are used during the plastics manufacturing, and these are antimony, BPA, BPS, BPF, and phthalates. The risk of exposure increases significantly with heat. And so why is this important? You say, because I'm not going to heat the water bottle. Yes, because you have to realize that if you're out in a basketball game and you leave it in the sun, it's going to get heated. But even more dangerous is you say, well, I'll leave it in my car. I want to leave it safe. Well, that car heats up tremendously. And that bottle left in that car accelerates the leaching of those chemicals into that water. Another important factor is UV exposure. We don't want to have that. And also, how long has this water bottle been around? Is it been reused? Is it something that you decided, well, I'm going to reuse it because I want to economize? It's not something we want to economize. Disposable water bottles should be disposed of after use. You shouldn't crimp them. We need to have a balanced perspective. Obviously, we need to have water, and at times we're not going to be near a tap. You're going to need bottled water. And it's not inherently dangerous, but it's not the one-time use that we're talking about. We're talking about the long-term, repeated use and habits that we have with this water that are important to realize. Because even though it's low dosage, in the long term, we have to realize that there's toxicity that can occur. So let's go to the next image, please. And we have to realize not to leave our water in a car. We don't want to leave it in a hot environment. And, tap water is not necessarily horrible. It got a bad reputation. But tap water also has certain issues. And depending on the region, tap water could contain too much chlorine or what's called chloramines. It can contain, especially in today's country, in our country, with 72 million Americans on psychiatric drugs, trace pharmaceuticals, heavy metals, such as lead from old pipes, agricultural runoff of pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, and all this can get into our water. Let's go into the next image, please. Engineer, thank you so much. Now here you see the New York City watershed. And our tap water factually comes from this area that's very controlled, which is a very important factor that was thought of by our leaders in New York State and New York City. And New York City uses chlorine to disinfect and make our water safe from bacterial infections. If you go to different countries, there are problems with the sewer systems, with the plumbing, with the water systems and the water pipes. And we have that in New York. We're very lucky that we have an excellent system. And it kills the bacteria, the viruses, and the fungi. And a small amount remains in our water, but this is in accordance with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to keep our water safe from infection. Now, how about trace pharmaceuticals? Well, luckily in New York City, it's very low. And why is that? Because our water is coming from upstate. And studies across the U.S. actually have detected trace amounts of those pharmaceuticals like analgesics or painkillers, hormones, psychotropic drugs, antibiotics in many water systems. But we want to give accolades and recognition where it matters. In New York City, testing has shown that the levels in our drinking water of these trace pharmaceuticals very, very low. In parts, we're talking about in parts per billion. Very, very low. And New York City's source water as I had mentioned, comes from the Catskill and Delaware watershed, which is very protected, as you see there in the image. And the present evidence shows that there's really no concern for these levels. The other thing that's important to realize is that because it's protected in certain occupations or professions or activities are not allowed around the watershed, we're protecting that from agricultural runoff of the pesticides, of the fertilizers, which is really very minimal in our New York City watershed when compared to other regions. So we laud the New York City government and the New York State government for having the foresight to do this with our water. This Catskill Delaware system is one of the largest unfiltered surface water supplies in the United States of America. And it has, as I mentioned to you, strict land use controls to control contamination. And we're very lucky to have this, and it's a great engineered system. Let's go to the next image, and we'll take a look at, with this tap water, is that it's very important to realize that the heavy metals, such as lead, don't come from our water system. They're not from the watershed. But because New York City has a history and the buildings, unfortunately, are getting older, many of those buildings have lead piping or lead appliances, lead systems, lead shutoffs. And so it's important to realize that the lead that's getting into a specific building is not from the public water supply, but from the infrastructure of that building, which needs to be looked at, the old plumbing. And let's go to the next image, and we need to take a look and inspect in those buildings. And if you have a home, and there are many homes in Queens and Brooklyn that are also over 100 years of age, some older, some a little bit less, but you really need to take a look and inspect what type of metal is in your pipes, and consider possibly filtration so that you would filter the water, aside from changing some of the plumbing that exists in your facility, in your house, in your commercial building. And it's very, very important. So lead enters when it leaves the public delivery as it gets into the actual distribution system within that facility. And that's really the most relevant concern in New York City. And we can actually address that by flushing the water, by running it, and using filters at different points to filter the water. And really, most importantly, is to replace the plumbing that's toxic. We want to economize on certain things, but when it comes to your health and having vitality and avoiding disease, we don't want to economize on things that are crucial for our existence. So it's important to realize that no water system removes 100% of every possible contaminant. We have to realize perfection is not possible. But we have to realize that our New York City water has been highly regulated and consistently meets, and actually in most cases exceeds, standards, and is often ranked amongst the highest of the water systems in municipalities across the entire United States of America. Let's go to the next image. And there you see The watershed is beautiful, pristine, and protected. And this is where our water is coming from. So what's the bottom line then for our New York City water and what you'd like to know from our show? Well, chlorine is present, but it's at a very safe level and for a specific purpose to keep away from infection. Pharmaceuticals are trace, if they are, and really negligible. Lead only really becomes a concern really within our responsibility, because now it's left the government, the public water supply, and it comes into that building. So the owner of that building, whoever that may be, is really responsible for that lead in that facility. And pesticides and runoff that we talked about is really minimal, because that area that you see on the screen right now is highly protected with a lot of legislation and regulations preventing certain activities within a certain distance of that reservoir. And our quality in general in New York City by US standards is very, very high. So our New York City tap water is generally safe, but it can vary depending on the, as I said, the local infrastructure and plumbing in your building. Now, obviously, we can't always be in a building or near tap water. So the reality is that at times we're going to need bottled water. And while bottled water offers convenience, it may introduce microplastics and packaging-related exposures. So the theme of this show is to be aware of, to be cognizant, and to take precautions as to how you're transporting and utilizing your water. The most practical approach overall would be in your lives is to improve your local infrastructure in your house, in your commercial building, or where you're renting from someone, and get the owner to do so, and to put filtration. And even if you're renting, use filtration. Don't expect the landlord to do everything. As I said, certain things we can economize on, but you probably should take a look and install a filter that you feel comfortable with, because it's going to be for your family and for you. And that filtration is important because, as we said, it's not a one-time exposure we're looking at. We're looking at a long run of what's happening. And so when appropriate, you want to consider that possibly you want to take your filtered water from your house and use containers like this, and containers that can be cleaned, that don't have those contaminants inside. So it's important to realize that this is something to be thought through, and for each one of you to make a plan. And obviously, as we've mentioned, using filtration aside from these containers, and assure that if you're driving somewhere, don't leave your water bottle in the car where it's going to heat up to tremendous temperatures, because cars get to very high temperatures with the sun beating on them, especially when we're probably going to be drinking that water in the summertime. So that's when, if we go to the beach and we don't want to leave it in the car, we want to avoid that exposure of the plastic so it doesn't leach any more of the antimony or the BPA or the BPF. We don't, or the phthalates. We don't want that to occur. So we want to keep that water bottle cool or cold. Probably it'd be a good idea to have it in a cooler, because that would suffice. And most people in the summertime, we like our drinks cold anyway. So it's probably one of the best solutions. And really what we're looking at here is to make an educated, informed choice to reduce your exposure. And, you know, that's the important thing. And if we go to this next image, I want to show you something we definitely don't want to do. And that's, you see sometimes people when they're drinking, they crimp their bottles, or they twist them, or they play with them as they're drinking them. That increases the nanoplastics, the microplastics that can actually come into that water bottle as you create these deformations. And if you squeeze the bottle as you're drinking, drink the water bottle, but don't squeeze it. Let the water just come out, and then don't save that water bottle. That's not where you want to economize. Throw that water bottle out. Do not reuse it, and say sayonara to it. That's really very, very important. Now, we've seen how much existed in those water bottles. So now we've got to take a look and see, well, what happens? Well, does it just simply pass through our bodies? Or is it leaving behind microscopic particles? Are they left behind? And the residues that came from this, you know, packaging or from its manufacture. Okay, we got to take a look. It's like, well, what is actually occurring? And what are the possibilities within the human tissue in our bodies? And so what we're going to do in part 2 of this series, we're going to take a journey. And we're going to see what's inside. What occurs? What are the realities? And examine what are the possibilities of what that water is doing inside. I hope you enjoyed this first segment, and stay tuned for part 2 of water. Is it safe? What is it doing? And how do we utilize it properly? We'll see you on the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this segment, and we'll go on in a few moments.
This show was sponsored by Atimefortruthfoundation Incorporated as a community service.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard. You don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart. Yeah. You try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got, but the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your feet